Entertained thousands of youth and young adults with his very engaging Be the Bee videos, where he compacts faith-based lessons into fast, digestible segments. While Stephen Christoforou is Be the Bee, he also has a larger role of serving as the Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. Before Stephen dedicated his life to serve the church, he earned his bachelor's degree at Yale University and earned his law degree at Fordham University, then led a career practicing law at a New York law firm. His unique background makes him the perfect presenter for our next convo, which is how to balance your faith and career. Toward the end of our next convo, Stephen will be facilitating a direct Q&A session. Please direct your questions privately to YAL Chairman George Anagnostopoulos using the direct message option in the Zoom chat. Please give a warm welcome to Stephen Christoforou.
Hey everybody, it's good to be here. I'm going to get my slides on the screen. While I do that, I'm going to share a cute little story about Father Barnabas. We actually overlapped at seminary together a couple years, and before I got there, I knew who he was because I used to follow this blog that he used to have. So life is weird. Sometimes you go from like following a person online to spending time with them at seminary, getting to know them, becoming friends, speaking together at a conference years later. Life is weird and funny, but thank God for it. Anyway, here we are. Get this up. Or this is the slides are on screen, okay? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a yes. Cool. Being an adult stinks. I mean, sure, you get to stay up late as you want, but the older you get, the less you're able to stay up late without severe consequences in the morning. And sure, you get to eat whatever you want, but again, the older you get, the less your body can cope with an all ice cream diet. So yeah, being an adult stinks. Not only are you not really free to exercise the freedom you thought you'd have as an adult, but it's also stressful. Midterms and GPAs are nothing compared to work, bosses, and bills. Maybe you took your first steps into the job market in 2020 when the economy collapsed. Or maybe you're a millennial who's been in the job market long enough to endure not one, but two historic crashes. You remember the Great Recession? Being a young adult sometimes feels like being on a hamster wheel. The harder you run, the more you tire yourself out, and yet you're still stuck in the same spot. I mean, I think of my grandparents. They bought a house in New York just a few years after they immigrated from Greece with nothing in their pockets. They went from literally tending goats on a bare mountainside to owning property in a major metropolitan area in less than 5 years. There's no way I could afford to place a down payment on a house, nor could I afford the mortgage. But you know what I am still paying? Student loans. Lots of them. And you probably are too. We're here to talk about balancing your faith and career, but what does balance even look like when you're supposed to go all in on your career just to survive? In the midst of all that craziness, where does your faith factor in? There are two answers to this question: the short, unhelpful answer and the longer, hopefully helpful answer. Hopefully. The short answer is no. You can't balance your faith and career. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Good night, everyone. That's the first answer, but we can do better than that. We can apply a little psychology and theology and simple life experience to explore why it's actually not a bad thing that this balance is impossible. But first, a story. When I was little, I had this awesome Big Wheels tricycle. If you don't remember Big Wheels, they're like normal tricycles, except way cooler and far more dangerous because the wheels are made of solid plastic that have absolutely zero grip. Somehow, I didn't die riding my Big Wheels, so I graduated to a normal tricycle with slightly less dangerous rubber wheels, and then I got it, a real big boy BMX bike. I felt so cool riding around on that thing. It was effortless, probably because it had training wheels. But then came the day when it was time for me to ditch the training wheels and ride my big boy bike for real. I'll never forget it. I was so nervous, but I took a deep breath and I went for it. It was such an amazing feeling to really balance on that bike, to be held up not by rickety training wheels, but this invisible cushioning force. For a moment, I felt like I was floating on a cloud, but then I started wobbling. because balance isn't a thing you simply achieve and then let go. It's a thing you work to maintain. I didn't realize that, so I toppled into a bush, which in retrospect was a blessing. Landing on the concrete would have been far more painful and messy. But I learned an important lesson that day. Balance isn't a thing you simply achieve. Balance is a thing you need to keep working at, which is the most basic reason why it's impossible to balance faith and career. The moment you think you have it figured out, you topple into a bush. So, okay, balance may not be an outcome, but it is a process. And what does that process look like? I'll tell you what it's not: having it all. I used to be a lawyer before I went to seminary. I worked at a very high-powered Wall Street firm doing big corporate deals and litigations. And when I first started working there, the firm hosted a panel discussion on work-life balance. There were 3 presenters, 2 men and 1 woman. The guys offered some vague, feel-good advice about how it's possible to have it all, both a fulfilling home life and a successful career. But the woman, one of the firm's top partners, didn't hold back. She told us in no uncertain terms that at some point, you're always going to have to choose what's most important to you. At some point, you're going to be watching your kid's ballet recital when work is going to call with something urgent. And in that moment, you're going to have to know how to choose between the two. She told us, point blank, if you want to get ahead, work needs to come first. When there's a conflict between her kid's ballet recital and an urgent client matter, the client comes first, always. And that's part of why she was a partner at this big fancy law firm. It was stone cold advice, but it was honest. There is no balance between work and life. You just have to know which is most important to you. She told us that those who think they're balancing work and life are actually shortchanging both. One of them has to come first, whether it's work or life. Life only makes sense when you stop balancing and start prioritizing. She told us that when you balance, all you do is make compromises that lead to everyone being unhappy. In practice, balancing work and life means missing a few recitals and missing a few important client meetings, which leaves both your kids and your clients unhappy. She looked this room full of young lawyers square in the face, and she told us that we simply needed to decide who we wanted to be. Are we going to be the lawyers who make sure that evenings and weekends belong to our families, or are we going to put the firm and clients first all the time? Honestly, she was right. The people who eventually become partners at big firms tend to be the ones who are willing to miss family dinners and birthdays and recitals because the client needs something now. And the people who are most human tend to be the ones who leave the big firm and work somewhere where evenings and weekends belong to their families. The people who have it figured out, one way or the other, don't try to balance. They make a decision about what comes first. And the less important things fill in the gaps left by the more important things. And the same goes for balancing faith and career. The two will inevitably come into conflict at some point. And when they do, you need to know which is more important to you. The phrase having it all became popular back in the 80s thanks to a self-help book of the same title. The 80s were a decade when America really embraced its crass consumeristic spirit. It's the era when Gordon Gekko famously announced that greed is good in the movie Wall Street. Having it all views the world through this consumeristic lens. Everything is a commodity that I can possess and control. Career is just another thing I have. Family is just another thing I have. Faith is just another thing I have. I want the best career. I deserve the best career. I want the best family. I deserve the best family. I want the best faith. I deserve the best faith. Ultimately, all of these things are goods that are intended to be consumed and used in order to obtain that cultural supergood. I'm talking about happiness. We chase happiness at every opportunity, but happiness is just a feeling that comes and goes. Think of the feeling when you get a new iPhone. It's great, but it wears off. And so we move on to the next good to consume, all in pursuit of the American supergood of happiness. Once again, we become hamsters, running as fast as we can, but ultimately running in place, never really acquiring the happiness we so desperately want. But maybe we get wise and begin to realize that stuff can't ever make us happy. Not really, anyway. You may even have said it yourself, money can't buy happiness. So you think back to the lessons you learned in Sunday school, and you remember, if you really want to be happy, then you need to have faith. Unfortunately, this isn't a solution because it swaps one hamster wheel for another. Because faith easily becomes yet one more consumeristic good to chase, something ultimately intended to help us acquire the super good of happiness. We choose faith because iPhones won't do the trick, not for any deeper reason. But what if faith isn't a consumer good? What if the point of life isn't to be happy? Don't get me wrong, happiness is something we probably all need more of, especially now, but can it really be the end game, the goal, the measure of a life worth living? If you ever took an intro to philosophy class, you may be familiar with the pleasure paradox, the idea that constant pleasure seeking doesn't actually lead to either pleasure or happiness. Generations of life experience bears this out. If we treat happiness as the goal of our lives, we will find life to be frustrating, boring, and ultimately flat. And unfortunately, when we treat faith as a means to attain the super good of happiness, well, faith also becomes frustrating, boring, and flat. And we wonder why so many young people fall away from the church as they get older. Growing up in the church, the life of faith that I was introduced to was shaped by this consumeristic mindset. The pillars of faith in the community were the wealthy parishioners who paid for things and got their name put up on shiny plaques. People didn't advance to leadership positions because they had a deep love of God or a genuine love of neighbor, because there was something compelling about the way they lived their lives, or because some genuine holiness radiated from them. No, church leadership always seemed like a subset of business success. That's what I saw growing up, and it's what I still see, to be honest. The people on top are never the holy, but simply the wealthy and well-connected. But this isn't the mind of Christ. This isn't the spirit of the church. As Christians, our goal isn't to acquire happiness or grasp control. It's not to approach life in this consumeristic way, seeking what we can get. Rather, the Christian life is about letting go. I want to share with you a few verses from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, which can help you see what I mean. Let this be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Jesus Christ, as we know, is the divine Son of God, the very creator of the universe, the all-powerful, all-knowing, beyond infinite King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And yet, this same Son of God, who had everything, was willing to give it all away out of love for us. Despite being in the form of God, he emptied himself and took on the form of a servant. The infinite creator of the universe allowed himself to be contained in a woman's womb. The all-powerful King of Kings became a helpless human infant that lay in a stinking manger in a dank cave. If there's one word I wouldn't use to describe the life of Jesus Christ, it's balanced. The Son of God didn't tiptoe into humanity. He went all in. He didn't come to us with the balance of a pagan deity, looking like a human, but throwing thunderbolts so you wouldn't forget who he really is. He was all in on humanity and all in on divinity. No confusion, no separation. He tipped the scales on both. He, the incarnate Word of God, hung naked, bloody, and beaten upon a cross. He died, like for realsies. And this is one of the paradoxes of the Christian life, because Jesus shows us the truth by going all in. As he hung upon the cross, utterly humiliated, meeting humanity at our lowest point, Jesus revealed the glory and majesty of God. As he lay in the tomb, utterly defeated, his broken body incapable of breath or motion or anything, Jesus revealed the cosmic victory of God. Jesus didn't balance anything. The very source of life accepted death. And it's only there in that paradox that we can truly have it all, because the Lord has given it to us. And really, it's all his to begin with. By taking on our human nature, he fills us with his divine energies. By taking on our death, he conquers death and grants us life. By taking on our mortality, he grafts us into his immortality. As we participate in him by letting go ourselves, or rather by letting go of ourselves, of our false and broken selves, as we discover who we really are in the light of Christ. Look, we're all modern people, Americans, and our biggest problem is that we think like modern Americans, that we think we can make a life for ourselves. We think that life is ours to be taken by the horns. We think that we can gain the whole world, and yet, in the meantime, we forfeit our souls. As Jesus himself tells us, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. We need to stop thinking like modern Americans and start thinking like Christians with the mind of Christ. Let me tell you another story. When I first heard from the great Father Patrick Henry Reardon, it's the story of some Greek-speaking Christians from Asia Minor who traveled west to Gaul to set up new businesses in these emerging markets early in the Roman Empire. These were merchants, yes, but they were also Christians. They wanted to travel to make money, but they didn't want to move to Gaul without spiritual leadership. So as these Greek-speaking Christians set up shop in Gaul, they had two clergymen with them, a bishop named Pothinus and a presbyter named Irenaeus. You may have heard of Irenaeus, or rather Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. He became a bishop of Lyon after Pothinus was killed by the Roman authorities. Many of the Christians who moved to Gaul died as martyrs, including, apparently, Saint Irenaeus at the start of the 3rd century. He wrote some incredible theological works that survive to this day, but more importantly, he was the shepherd of a community that transformed Gaul within a generation. That community went to Gaul to make money, to build successful businesses, which they did. But more than that, they built the church. They saved souls. Within a generation, Gaul went from pagan to Christian, within a generation. As Father Patrick observed when I heard him tell this story, these Christians weren't missionaries. They didn't have a plan to spread the gospel. They just couldn't help it. They were so in love with Jesus, so as Father Patrick put it, obsessed with Jesus, that they were living witnesses to the gospel in all things. And when faced with the choice, many gave their lives as martyrs in witness to the gospel, in witness to Christ. These Greek-speaking Christians from Asia Minor didn't live with balance. They weren't Sunday morning Christians for whom their relationship with Jesus was just a part of what they did during the week. Rather, their relationship with Jesus was the most important thing about them. They were incredibly successful business people, and yet without even trying, they became some of the most successful Christian missionaries in all of church history. Because their life wasn't about balance. Instead, it was about prioritizing. It was about putting first things first. Business was important, sure, but when faced with the choice, they chose Jesus over business. And not just those who faced martyrdom. These Christians did business in such a way, these Christians simply lived in such a way that they transformed the lives of their neighbors and led them to Christ. Maybe this seems a little excessive, maybe even a bit grandiose, so I want to give you another example. Unlike these Christians in Gaul, this one is fictional, and yet it comes from one of my favorite TV shows, Community. Community is a delightfully weird show that follows the life of Jeff Winger, a successful, if sleazy, attorney whose amoral life comes back to bite him. You see, Jeff never actually graduated from college. He faked his degree, and when the state bar finds out, his law license is suspended. Jeff faked his college degree because he wasn't the type to work harder than he needed to. So forced to actually earn his bachelor's, Jeff decides to take the easy way. He goes to Greendale Community College, where he hopes to get the answers from one of his friends, who is a professor, and coast his way to a degree, and thus back to his successful law career. But things didn't go as Jeff planned. Right in the first episode, Jeff's professor friend decides not to give him the answers. Jeff finds himself a part of a study group of weirdos and misfits all of whom happen to be taking the same Intro to Spanish course. And this is the first step in the slow yet thorough transformation of Jeff Winger. For the first few seasons, Jeff has his eyes on the prize, graduating from Greendale as early as he can while expending as little effort as possible. He tries to strike a careful balance between Greendale and the study group on the one hand, and his career ambition on the other. But of course, this balance is a lie. What's most important to Jeff is his law career and getting back on top. Everything else comes after that, even people. At least at first. Through the course of the series, Jeff changes. His study group becomes his family. Greendale becomes his home. At the end of the series, Jeff is still at Greendale, now as a law professor. At the start of the show, Jeff was all about himself, but over time, his heart changed. His life, as he tells us in the finale, was saved by his new family. Career and ego were no longer the things of ultimate importance. Jeff put his home and his family first, and that became the lens through which he made his decisions, including the decision to not return to the sleazy law practice he so desperately wanted for so long. As Christians who are now old enough to figure this out for ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, what really comes first in our lives? Because there is no balance between faith and career. When we kid ourselves and try to reach this balance, what we're actually saying is that career comes first, that faith is something we squeeze in on the margins. A Sunday morning here, maybe a holiday there. Faith becomes just another thing on our calendar, just another thing on our to-do list, just another activity or club. And so, lying to ourselves about this faith-career balance, we fall into a bush. But that's not what faith was for those Greek-speaking Christians from Asia Minor. Faith wasn't a thing. It wasn't a what, it was a who. Because they were obsessed with the person of Jesus Christ. He always came first, and the rest of their lives only made sense in light of him. It is Jesus, not happiness, who is the super good for humanity. It is ultimately him and more of him that we need, not just so that we can be happy, but so that our lives themselves can actually reflect the eternally good. If we want to have it all, let's make sure that our all is Jesus Christ, who is himself all in all. I used to visit Mount Athos a lot, so I got to know several fathers at a handful of monasteries really well. And during one of my trips, I was talking to one of the monks. It was back when I was just starting seminary and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, which admittedly I still haven't figured out. But he told me, whatever I do, the key is to put the proper things in the proper order. He told me that if I ever get married and ordained, for example, I have to make sure that the parish doesn't come first. First and foremost, he told me, you're a Christian. Your relationship with God comes first. If you're too busy doing the work of the church to pray, then you're not really doing the work of the church. Second, he told me, you're married. If you're married, you're a husband. Your relationship with God comes first, but just after that comes your relationship with your wife, because your marriage only makes sense in light of your relationship with God. You are called to love your wife as Jesus loves the church. Your love for God is the model of and source for your love for your wife. It's really weird. That Athonite monk and the Wall Street law partner I mentioned earlier gave me the same advice: to prioritize, to put first things first. They were both right, but for very, very different reasons. Putting first things first changes everything. When God, who is the source of all good gifts, comes first, that transforms how we relate to all the good gifts in our lives. We don't seek balance between God and our spouse, for example. Instead, we put God first. And that priority unlocks something, because a relationship like that becomes a living witness to the gospel. It becomes something that isn't grounded in unhealthy boundaries or codependence or something fundamentally unwell. It's a relationship grounded in the truth. And of course, the truth is a person. The truth is Jesus Christ, who tells us that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And the same needs to be true as we figure out what faith and career look like in our everyday lives. When we put God first, that changes the way we lead our careers. If we're too busy to have a healthy prayer life, something is wrong. Just like something is wrong if we're too busy to have time for our families. If we're so obsessed with the desire for success that we're willing to bend the rules and do whatever it takes, even if it's kind of sketchy, something is wrong. So let's give up the dream of having it all. We can't do it. Let's not seek a life of balance. It's not a thing. Instead, let's go all in. Let's go all in on Jesus, because he is continually going all in on us. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
I put together a couple of questions for us to think about, just kind of questions for personal reflection or group discussion later on, but.
Awesome. That was a really great convo for so many reasons, but I think mainly because you challenge this societal norm of balancing and you can have it all. And I think as young adults, most of us are, trying to figure out our careers or entering the transition between higher education and our career. So this is such a pertinent topic on our journey to reclaim. Before we get into the Q&A portion, I just wanted to make a quick announcement for those of you who just joined the Zoom meeting. After the Q&A concludes here with Steve, we're going to be having our YAL social hour speed networking, and that will be broken up by the career that you inputted when you registered. And so those Zoom name configurations, depending on your career field, are in the Zoom chat now. We ask that you please make those changes to your Zoom name as soon as possible so we can effectively put you in the correct career breakout at the end of our Q&A session. Thank you. All right, Steve. There's so much to unpack from your talk. And like I said, there's a lot of important points. And so we have a few questions for you. The first one is, how does one navigate and succeed in the secular hierarchy of selfish competition, but simultaneously retain a Christ-like mentality?
That's a great question. And this is where it comes, this is where we have to sort of remember what's more important at the end of the day, right? Is it worth it to climb a ladder that feels fundamentally corrupt? Is it worth it to climb a ladder that feels fundamentally sketchy or morally compromised? That's a choice that we have to make, right? Is it better for us to have a slightly lower salary, at a slightly less prestigious firm or whatever it might be, than to be at the very top, right? To use even like that law example, is it worth it to be on top if you're kind of telling people right off the bat that you're never going to make time for your kids, right? Is it worth it at the end of the day if you have to make morally questionable decisions or things that you're not comfortable with, right? It's a question of just choosing at the end of the day. And I think like, this is why Jeff from Community becomes such an interesting example, because he's an interesting character, and we're going to talk about him actually on our pop culture podcast that we do in a couple of weeks. But his career at the end of the series does not look at all like the career he wanted at the start of the series, right?
Right.
And yet that's a choice that he makes. And he's happy with that choice because he wants something different when he kind of reevaluates what comes first, right? That's always got, this kind of connects to Father Barnabas's talk about the why, right? When you're clear about what your why is, the rest of the things are going to click into place. And that's just a question we all have to decide.
Exactly. That's such a good point. And I think you following Father Barnabas about answering and what why means and starting with that, I think is a really, really beautiful thing. For you personally, someone had a question. It's great to hear from someone that perhaps had a career path figured out and then decided to follow another path, in your instance, the church. Was there a moment or a breaking point when you knew it was time to refine your why, as Father Barnabas said, and reassess your priorities?
That's a good question. So my priority for a long time was I had a very kind of specific career goal in mind. When I was a little kid, It's very silly in retrospect. But when I really wanted to grow up to become president of the United States, I had these very sort of like grandiose ambitions. Like I want to do something really important, and my own like latent insecurities, I think, kind of led to this really stupid career path that I had for myself. So I'm like, I'm going to go to a prestigious college, and then I'm going to go to law school and work. And I had this like 40-year life plan, like incrementally, like 6-month goals, year-month goal, whatever it is. And when I was in college, my father passed away, and at that point, I was nominally a Christian, like in the best of scenarios. I didn't go to church, didn't have a prayer life, wasn't terribly interested in who God is. But when my dad died, I prayed for the first time in many years because I was deeply troubled by the loss of my dad. And if there is no God, then there is no dad, right? Because there is no afterlife and there's nothing. And just for weeks, I kind of called out to a God who I wasn't sure was there to ask him to take care of my dad, who I also wasn't sure was there anymore. And after a couple of weeks of doing this, like just pouring my heart out and like just weeping and being a mess, I had this sense that like an arm comes around me and comforted me, and like not a real arm, but like a voice comes to me, and not a real voice, but tells me like, he's okay, he's with me. And I mean, that happened in 2003, and I'm still kind of trying to figure out what that means. Because if in the vast emptiness and magnitude of the universe, right, we look into the world and we see these stars that are light years away, millions of light years away, whatever it is. In the vastness of all of that, I cried into the darkness, and somebody was there, and somebody heard me, and somebody bothered to answer. Like that's what changed everything for me. And that figuring out what that was and sharing that with other people became my why. At that point, like I'd already taken the LSAT training. And so like I had all this momentum that was taking me to law school. And then my spiritual father was like, don't drop out, just finish, your mom wants you to be a lawyer, like finish law, whatever it is. So I finished, and then I had debt. And so I had to work for a couple of years anyway. But eventually I woke up one summer and I was like, I can't say no to this anymore. And a couple of weeks later I was up at seminary. So, sometimes like your why might take a while to kind of click into place. Cause again, like there's other kind of pressures that you're under, but I think it's kind of helpful to understand like, what's your life all about and where are you going? What are you doing? What are you doing with yourself?
Sure. Well, and it's so nice and refreshing to hear, someone like you be so vulnerable, to share with us your experience of how, a life event happened in your life, specifically with your dad, and it really, caused you to reassess your why, and to, and to really, share with the wider group here that it's really one of those things where we're all kind of a work in progress. And if we think we have something figured out, God has a greater plan for us. And so there's these instances in our lives where that comes to fruition and that manifests itself. And so it's beautiful to hear your story. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
We do have some questions for our next segment of the Q&A for how young adults can put what you've spoken about today into action. So our next question is, what are some practical ways I can prioritize my faith, even though I have a stressful job that still requires long hours and leaves me limited free time?
That's a fair question, right? This becomes a question of one kind of practical tip that I like doing is and it's kind of a business, personal, whatever kind of trick. If things are not on your calendar, they're not going to get done, right? And I realize this sometimes when it comes to like work meetings that I'm supposed to have, right? If I don't actually make sure that it's prioritized, it's one of the things that's on my calendar for the day, it's not going to get done. The more that you have on your plate, the more things are kind of like urgent things are constantly competing for your attention. It's the things that you prioritize at some point that you just list out. These are the things that I'm going to do today. And it might be something as simple as that, right? I actually got it here. I have like a little paper planner that I tend to use every day for the things that I intend to accomplish. In the morning, as I'm doing my morning routine, like I kind of think about the things that I need to do today, both personal and professional, and you write it down and you kind of like set goals for yourselves and you block out certain things on the calendar, right? Like if that 2 o'clock meeting with your supervisor is important, you're going to meet with your supervisor at 2 o'clock. Like that hour, that half hour is blocked out on your calendar. If your prayer time is important, like it's going to be blocked out on your calendar. 5 minutes in the morning, right? Before you head out the door, whatever it might be. Or if it's a feast day, right? Like you might talk to your boss about going in late or whatever it might be, right? It's just like, because we all have 24 hours of the day. We all get to sort of like, we all have some level of free time, I would hope. The question is what we do with that free time. And I think it starts with being intentional at the very beginning, right? And deciding like what we want to happen before this day is done. And making sure that we're like in balance so that it happens. Like I even see this working for the church. There are times when I'm simply working too hard and I start making excuses for myself in terms of like, oh, I'm going to sleep in for church on Sunday because I worked 70 hours this week. I can sleep in on church this Sunday or whatever it might be. Boundaries and balance become important there. Like me, I'm not actually doing the work of the church if I'm not making time for God and I'm not making time for church. I have to make sure that there are clear boundaries in place and that the things that I'm prioritizing are getting done, which is to say, making a little bit of time for him every morning, every evening, at least going to church and liturgy on Sunday. If I'm not doing that, something's out of balance, right? That can become even a little bit of a North Star in your own life, right? Sunday morning, it's blocked out. 5 minutes every morning, blocked out. 5 minutes before bed every evening, blocked out. And it can be as simple as that.
That's so good to hear, and Steve. And I think, one of the things where it's important to have some type of a consistent, schedule or a routine for our faith and our prayer life is because, like you said, life happens, and it goes by in a blink of an eye. And if you aren't, going through the motions and going through the days and haven't really made it a priority to be grounded in that, I think at first it makes it harder for you to get back into it and to, reclaim your faith like we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So the next question from a participant says, towards the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that sometimes it feels like it takes 100% in your career just in order to get by or even take care of your family. How do you navigate those special moments when it feels like you need to put a lesser priority first in order to take care of a greater priority?
Yeah, that's fair. And life is messy, right? And so I think there's two things to keep in mind. Not everybody on this call is going to like, I'm going to, ditch my career entirely and go to seminary or whatever it might be, right? Like most of us are going to be doing some, whatever it might be, working in marketing, working in law, working in medicine, working whatever it might be, right? The key though is to have that priority in place and to at least have a sense of like, this is number one, this is number two, this is number three. At the end of the day, things are prudential calls, right? Like even if you're the sort of person who's like, my goal is, 5 o'clock, 5:30, whatever it is, my phone is over on the side because I want to be attentive, like to family dinner, or I want to be whatever you have kind of these boundaries around yourself. There might be a time when something at work is so pressing that as an exception to the rule, it sort of bumps in, right? I think the key is to realize, like, make sure the exceptions stay exceptions and make sure that like there's still kind of like a long-term priority that's in place. Like, I think you see this I have very workaholic sort of tendencies. People like me who have very permeable sort of boundaries when it comes to that work-life balance. We just need to sort of like constantly remind ourselves of what comes first. This can something that helps me in the same way as like it's helpful to write things down. Like, this is what I want to get done at the end of the day. I have goals that are written down, like my quarterly goals, my annual goals, and I review them regularly. So I remind myself. I also have like a little sort of vision statement about myself and my life that I look at every now and again, because sometimes we can be so caught up on autopilot that we're like responding to things rather than proactively shaping the shape of our lives. And this, again, it's like a very personal development, leadership, sort of business best practice, right? If you have annual goals, quarterly goals, weekly goals, a vision statement or some sense of like, this is what's actually most important to me, and you review that again and again, it kind of sinks in. And like, even if there are exceptions and things break and there are emergencies, and you can have grace for yourself, right? Like something might happen on a Sunday morning and you can't go to church, right? Because something is urgent, like that happens. But at the end of the day, it's helpful to like shape that why, shape that, like, this is my 1, 2, 3 priorities, whatever it is, and return to it regularly. I do it with a personal, like a written planner. You could be a more digital person, you could be an analog person who likes writing down, but I'd say start there. Write a vision statement for your life, list your priorities, and like return to that often, and use those priorities to shape what happens during your year, to shape what happens during the quarter, to shape what happens during the week, and to shape what happens during the course of a particular day. And forgive yourself if sometimes life gets overwhelming and things crack a little bit, because that's also life.
Right. And I think it's really key to, like you were saying, to, have these, mini milestones or these mini check-ins, because, as young adults, so much of our time is spent in the workplace, where it kind of becomes this all-consuming thing. A Gallup poll from 2019 came out recently, and it said millennials, so our generation mostly, spend almost 85% of their time in the workplace. It's the most ever out of any population segment. And so it's kind of a harrowing statistic to see, how much time, young adults are spending in the workplace, and giving that, and, realizing that stat. It's really integral to, making sure that wherever you are, and if that's the workplace, that you're incorporating your faith and incorporating your personal growth, and checking in on yourself, regardless of what's kind of happening around you. So
yeah, can I jump in on that for a second too? That
yeah.
I think is helpful, just as like a grown-up skill that we all need to figure out at some point, is because there's kind of two sides to the coin. Like, one is knowing what's important, and two is learning how to safeguard those boundaries and learning how to say no to things that overstep those boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Like what's tragic, I think, in the workplace situation, like if you looked at that kind of situation and there was like a romantic relationship that had that kind of give and take, like that would be a very toxic, unhealthy sort of relationship. That would be the sort of relationship that all of your friends would be like, you need to break up with him or her, right? We need to be better about like understanding who we are and maintaining the boundaries around us and learning how to say no to things that are unhealthy. And like, it's a scary thing, but I think the world as a whole will be a lot better if people said no to some of these unhealthy pressures. Like, it's inexcusable at the end of the day that like we have this hamster wheel sort of mentality. We're working harder and harder. We're not getting out of it. Like, people just need to start, like, maybe in small steps at the very beginning, but learning how to say no, because this is why people crack.
Yeah. And I think, coming out of 2020, I think for a lot of us has really, really changed what it means to really have a, as we say, a work-life balance. And it's really kind of changed not only the workplace, but how we kind of, are existing currently in the current moment that we're in as young adults. And so our final question for the Q&A is such: what do you do if you only have one of the different things that you are talking about, i.e. a family, but not a career, or a career, but not a family? Other than prayer, how would you try to balance later in life when you are so used to doing just one thing?
That's a really good question. When we start talk about that priority, right? Like knowing like God is number one, and then, if it's a spouse is number two, right? Kids number three, whatever it is. Like we all, I think it's maybe helpful for us to sort of pause at one point and think, like, what are the actual like priorities in our lives? Like, I live alone. I'm not in a relationship. I don't have family dynamics to sort of deal with, right? So I don't have to, like, that's not the kind of family dynamic that I use as a balance. But when I think about it, and like this honestly becomes part of like my goals, right? One goal that I have for myself is to make time every day to have like one personal connection with a friend or family member. Like every day to have like one telephone call, one sort of extended text in exchange, right? Like one sort of touch point that is not just me working all day and just doing this all day, because I think it's like for my own like mental health and psychological health, and because like even if it's not immediate family, right? I mean, like family and connections are still important. So like I'm going to make sure that I call my kumbado every now and again. I'm going to make sure that I call my buddies from seminary every now and again. I'm going to make sure I call my aunts and uncles, cousins, whatever it is. That becomes a goal, right? And I think the rhythm of that is the same. You kind of have a sense of what's important to you, and then you begin actually like taking steps to implement it and to schedule it. So like in my little quarterly journal that I have, one of my goals for the quarter is every day I have like this personal touch point with a friend or a family member. In the same way that I have professional goals, like I want to finish this project, whatever it is, that's one of my goals that's on there, along with, you know, praying every morning, praying every evening, like those other kind of spiritual goals. They're there. I've identified them as important. I make time for them. I schedule them on my calendar, or I make sure they're like have priority on my to-do list, and I go with them. So even if you have kind of a there's you don't have the same stress between like fate, like family and work life or whatever it is, there are still going to be these concentric circles. You know, you're going to have hobbies, you're going to have interests, whatever it is. I think we're all three-dimensional human beings. It's worth at some point like just jotting down like what's important to you, right? Ranking them in order of importance. And then saying like, okay, if art is really important to me, like here's another goal that I have for myself, to play 15 minutes of music every day, right? Because creativity is important to me and music is important to me, like to make sure that work doesn't get overwhelming so that it takes away from my spiritual side and my creative side, right? That's
Right.
not other people, not family or whatever, but it's important. I schedule it. And because I schedule it, that's when it starts getting done. So think about it. What are your spheres, and how can you actually like put them on your checklist, your calendar, whatever it might be for the day?
Totally. Thank you so much, Steve. That concludes our Q&A. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and for that fascinating convo. So everybody, please give Steve a virtual round of applause. That was really, really awesome and a great way.
So many ones and zeros. So many ones and zeros. Thank you.
We're going to send them all to you.